Today, chess kids, we are off to the races. I hope you brought your running shoes. We're going to look at situations where kings are chasing pawns and pawns are racing against each other. Let's take a look at this first typical example. White has one last pawn. If that pawn gets a promotion, surely by now you know how to checkmate with a king and a queen. But will the pawn make it? Well, the first thing I want to talk to you about is the square of the pawn. I bet you didn't know there was an invisible square on the chessboard. Take a look at Mr. Pawn up here on the square A5. What I'd first like to do is count how many squares before that pawn gets a promotion. 1, 2, 3. Now we all know squares have equal sides, so we have to count to the right 3. 1, 2, 3. Let's go ahead and fill in all of the boxes of that square. And it's time to figure out, is the black king inside the square of the pawn? Well, no, he's not. However, if he was inside the square of the pawn, he would be able to catch the pawn. For instance, if the black king moved to the square D6, he would now be inside the square of the pawn, and he would be able to catch the pawn. If you don't believe me, let's take a look. And just in time, the black king gets back. White gets a promotion, but only lasts a half second. The king captures the queen. If, instead, the king was one step further away, he would not have been able to capture the pawn. For instance, if the king had started on the square F6, and I put that pawn back on the square A5, and I give black the first move, now the king can only get to the square E6, and the square of the pawn extends only to the D file, you might recall. So the pawn advances, and notice the square of the pawn gets smaller. Now it goes up 1, 2, and if we count to the right 1, 2, and we fill in all of our boxes, I think you can see the black king is not able to get inside this square. So although the king keeps getting closer, the square of the pawn keeps getting smaller, and in this particular situation, the pawn would get a touchdown, and of course you can win with the king and a queen without problem because you've already watched that video. Okay, next situation. Here, we've got a little bit more complicated. It's a king versus a pawn, but this time there's a trick to the square of the pawn. If we were to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then count to the right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it sure looks like the black king is inside the square of the pawn because he's on the G file. However, if it's white's move on the first turn, remember, a pawn can move 2 squares on the first turn. And the funny thing is now the square was shrunk too much for the black king to catch up. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm not going to bother filling in all of the other red boxes, but I think you can see the black king is not able to get inside the square of this pawn. He's just a little bit too far away, so white is going to go on to win. Next situation, let's take a look at what happens when pawns are racing against each other. This is a simple counting exercise. Now I say simple, obviously all of us can count to 8, that would be the maximum number you have to count to. But here, a lot of times I don't see chess kids count correctly. When I was growing up and pawns were racing against each other, my chess coach actually told me to point using one of my fingers for each pawn and point at the squares the pawns are racing toward. Now you can't actually touch the board in a real chess game, but if you were playing on ChessKid.com, you could touch the squares of your screen. Don't do it on an iPad though, you might accidentally make a move you don't want to make. But as long as you're not using a touchscreen, you could do it. Let's actually count how many squares for the pawn to get a touchdown for white. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And let's use our other finger to count the number of squares until the black pawn gets a touchdown. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this should be a tie. Both sides are going to get a queen, and unless there's something exceptional going on, queen versus queen should be a tie. Let's start making moves for white. White moves up, black moves up, white moves up, black follows. And of course, these are all the best moves because the kings can't catch the pawns in this situation. White gets a queen, black gets a queen, and unless somebody does something really extraordinarily great or terrible, this game should be a draw. So you just have to count really carefully. Again, use both of your fingers if it helps you count carefully. Let's go on to the next situation. Again, let's make it white to move first. And if we were to count, we would see that white has 1, 2, 3 squares until he gets his queen. Black has 1, 2, 3. Now, it would be easy to just conclude that the game should be a tie. But sometimes in chess, there are special things going on. Part of being a grandmaster is that you have to look a little bit further down the road than your opponent. Let's play this out, and I want to show you the trick that I have in store. So white moves up, black moves up, white moves up, black moves up, and indeed, both sides get a queen, just like we predicted. But the white player saw a little bit further down the road. After both sides get a queen, white can slide his queen over to g8 with check. Now black's king has no choice but to walk to the h-file. He can pick any of these 3 squares. It doesn't matter which one. We'll pick the square h4. Now do you see how the black king and queen are aligned? They're on the same file. And we've already had a chess video about this. It is time for a skewer. Let's put our queen on the square h8. Uh-oh. Black's king has to run away because it's check. And the beauty of a skewer is that you always can stab that piece behind the king. So even though it was a tie to get the queen, sometimes you've got to look a little bit further and see if there are any important checks with your queen or tricks that you can have your opponent fall into. Speaking of which, the most famous chess movie of all time had this exact situation happen at the end of the movie. This is the end of the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer. Josh Waitzkin, our hero, was playing white, and he counted here that his pawn needs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 turns to make a touchdown. But black's pawn only needed 1, 2, 3, 4. So it looks kind of bad for Josh, right? Well, he's a Hollywood hero. Something was going on that his opponent did not see. This is how the movie ended. Josh moved his pawn, and they got in our typical pawn race. Now we analyzed that black would get a queen first. That's almost always a good thing when you get your queen first. But I think you guys are seeing what's coming up. Black's king and queen are on the same diagonal. So once again, the skewer is coming up. Josh moved his pawn forward.
Check.
He got a queen with check. And when black slid his king out of danger, the white queen swooped all the way down and captured the black queen. And that was the end of the movie. Black tipped his king over and gave up, and Josh won the national championship. Let's review. When a king is chasing a pawn, you need to count the square of the pawn. If the enemy king can get inside the square, then he's able to catch the pawn. But when it comes to pawn races, one pawn versus another, you need to count carefully with both of your pointer fingers. Whoever gets a queen first has the better chances, but you don't always win because you have to look out for some of the